two more, there we go. I couldn't ask for two more, perfect embodiments of journals that care about place and LGBT, but specifically trans writing, to come together and help co-sponsor this event. So I'm just so appreciative. And I am going to start by also saying where I'm calling from. So I am a writer and editor, and I live on land that has nourished many different communities of Indigenous peoples, and it continues to be stewarded by the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. And at the same time, I also think it's important to note that I don't write from here. I write from a city called Portland, which rests heavily alongside and over top of this other place. And I have struggled to feel a claim to any relationship to either of these places, really. Portland is this kind of non-place, a space in my brain, whereas the land where the Confederated Tribes live and create art and meaning is something that I kind of see on the horizon from my own point of view. So in lieu of a traditional land acknowledgement, I kind of wanted to talk about that. I'm sure it's something we'll touch on more in the next hour about how, stories and narratives and geography don't always go hand in hand easily. But for now, I'm going to read a short intro for each panelist. And we'll do Kofi last because I know that they were having a little bit of computer trouble. But basically, what I'm going to do is read a brief introduction for each writer that we have with us here today. And after I introduce each writer, I'm going to ask them to just speak a little bit about where are you writing from now, in whatever concrete abstraction feels most resonant at the moment. Okay. So we'll start with Kamala Macarel. Is a Montreal-based Mauritian Canadian multidisciplinary artist, educator, writer, and translator. Most recently, their debut poetry collection, Zomfam, was published by Metonymy Press and named a CBC Best Poetry Book, a Globe and Mail Best Debut, and was longlisted for the Gerald Lampert Memorial Award and shortlisted for the QWF Concordia University First Book Award. They were recently a finalist for the Writers' Trust of Canada's Dane Ogilvie Prize for LGBTQ2S+ emerging writers. Kema, where are you writing from now?
Thank you, Cal. Thank you for this generous introduction and this invitation. I'm writing from Dijage on the traditional territories of the Kanien'kehá:ka, which in colonial terms is known as Montreal, Quebec /Canada. I'm also writing from a space of trying to grasp with colonial history and colonial sciences and finding ways of articulating a decolonial utterance within that. I'm writing from Mauritius, which is where I'm from, where I was born and lived until adulthood. Most of my work, the majority of my work is I do write from Mauritius, so I think, as you were saying, Cal, like it complicates that notion of where we're writing from geographically speaking. But I think for me, there are a lot of links and overlaps in terms of colonial history and in terms of then thinking of writing from a space, a spiritual, physical, ecological space of decoloniality. So I would say this is where I'm writing from.
Beautiful. Thank you, Kema. Now let's go to Camellia-Berry Grass, otherwise known as Cami, is originally from rural Missouri, got their MFA in Tuscaloosa, and now lives and teaches writing in Philadelphia. They are the author of Hall of Waters, published by The Operating System, which is an exploration of their hometown Excelsior Springs, Missouri, through race, histories of health and water, and the contradictory art of Donald Judd. They have previously served as nonfiction editor of Black Warrior Review and Sundog Lit. Cami, where are you writing from now?
That's such a good question. And yeah, the idea of overlapping multiplicity of spaces and places in any one geographic location is really something I think we'll get into a lot tonight. The city of Philadelphia, very notoriously a place where William Penn signed a treaty with the Lenni Lenape, and a treaty that was very quickly reneged on in so many ways. And, William Penn's body is sort of, there's a statue of him atop City Hall, and my old apartment, I could look out the window and see his butt, and that was a metaphor for something, I think. But I'm not really writing from this place, even though I've lived here for seven years now. Wow, oh my gosh. I'm mostly writing from Missouri still, writing from the micro places of particular bedrooms and domestic struggles. And I think the overlapping of places and headspaces is the most accurate way to suss up where I'm writing from. My book, Hall of Waters, was very specifically about the small part of the state of Missouri to try and say something representative about the Midwest, specifically to try to demythologize the white settler imaginary of that place. And I'm sure I'll touch on that more later tonight too. Glad to be here.
So happy to have you, Cami. Thanks. Kai Minosh Pyle is a Two-Spirit Metis and Bawitting Anishinaabe writer, originally from Green Bay, Wisconsin. As well as writing poetry, essays, and fiction, they are deeply involved in revitalizing their heritage languages, Michif and Ojibwe. Their work has appeared in many different venues, including the recent Love After the End, an anthology of Two-Spirit and indigiqueer speculative fiction, published by Arsenal Pulp Press. They are a doctoral student in American Studies at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. Kai, where are you writing from now?
Ani and Tansha. So I think the shortest answer to that question is definitely the Western Great Lakes, which is really what I consider to be my homeland. And I'm calling in today from the Oneida Reservation on the outskirts of Green Bay, Wisconsin, which is where I grew up, and is a place that when we give land acknowledgements here, there's a very complicated history to this area, but the Menominee and Ho-Chunk peoples have longstanding ties to this place, and the Oneida, who were removed here in the 1820s, do as well. And my family has very long ties to this place while not belonging to any of those three peoples, due to the complexities of colonial history, being indigenous to this region, but not to this specific place. So I'm really kind of grappling with that in my writing right now. I've lived in a couple different places in the Midwest and always seem to end up coming back here to Green Bay. And so I'm kind of trying to figure out what's up with that. And the other thing I would say is that I've been lately really trying to figure out how to write about being queer and trans, about being like a trans person who, although I don't identify as male, is like on the spectrum of a man who loves men. And so those are like some of the sort of like emotional places that I'm writing from as well at this moment. Those are the things that I've been thinking about.
Wonderful, thank you. We love emotional places. Okay. And Kofi, I saw you come in. So Kofi Daniel Opam is a Black transgender writer from Queens, New York. A recent Iowa Arts Fellow, Kofi's work has appeared in the Atlas Review, the Gallatin Review, and the Seventh Wave. Their work explores mythology, surrealism, and horror in the Caribbean, West Africa, and North America. And they are a graduate of the University of Iowa MFA in nonfiction writing. And Kofi, you probably caught on by now, but I'm asking everyone, where are you writing from now?
Well, I'm currently in the Iowa City Public Library, literally, because my computer broke last like 2 days ago. But I'm literally a little bit, I think, south in Iowa City, a little bit southeast of you Kai. On occupied land in Iowa City. I write. This is also, I think, like all of us, I think is a complex question, because at any given point, I've noticed a lot of themes I read about exile or about diaspora are gripping themes to Haitian and Ghanaian immigrants. I read a lot about the way that my Haitian family came to the United States during dictatorship. I read a lot about anti-Black racism, being a queer Black trans person, all of that, all of the stuff that comes with, obviously, or not obviously, to white people. It's, like the kind of the horror of how that's really not obvious. So to people who don't share those, identities. I write about, about water quite often. I often write from water, from places in water. That's all I'll answer with for now.
Great.
Kind of like in this room.
I love it. Thanks so much for being with us today. All of you. That's so great to hear where you're all coming from emotionally, geographically, technologically. So thank you. I would like to start with, come back to you, Kai, for just a moment. And I think you gave us a good place to start, actually, with 2 lines from your story, How to Survive the Apocalypse for Native Girls, which was recently included in the anthology Love After the End that I mentioned in your bio. And this is a story for those who haven't read it. You should all go get that book and you should all read it. But for those who haven't, it's kind of a diary style story told from the point of view of this young two-spirit Native girl. And there's 2 lines that I think will help us, give us 2 poles around which a lot of this conversation can revolve. And the protagonist says towards the end that they're not sure, quote, if home will even mean the same thing to me once I've left. And they also write that, quote, the only way to survive the apocalypse is to make your own world. And so I think these make, again, 2 great points for us to start with, and that we can kind of talk around for the next hour or so. And I wonder, Kai, if you could maybe begin by speaking to the process of locating one's own self, perhaps your own self as a writer in place, and especially for you, maybe how this connects to language in your work.
Yeah, for sure. So let me think. Yeah, I guess with those 2 lines, and especially like the first thing that comes to mind, since I was just talking about, my sort of relationships to the Green Bay area, is the fact that I grew up here, and then at age 18 moved away, thinking I wanted to get like as far away from Green Bay as possible. I only got as far as Chicago, which is not very far, but it did really change how I thought about my hometown. And I found myself working through that in my writing quite a lot. One of the first pieces that I remember like seriously like writing with the sort of like intent of, not of publishing because I wasn't thinking about that at that time, but like thinking about it as a serious writing piece for myself was about my relationship to like the lake, and the lake being the same back home as it was in Chicago. And like just playing with that language. And so, yeah, with regards to language, the first thing that always comes to mind for me with that is the sort of fact of writing in English, which is also was present in that piece about that I was just speaking about, that about the lake and Green Bay and Chicago, and sort of the pain of realizing at that time that I didn't know how to speak my indigenous languages. I had been learning a little bit, but so when I think about language, yeah, it's just it's a tricky thing, and I do write in Anishinaabe or Ojibwe as well, and it's interesting, I think, because that language has a very different way of talking about place. A lot of things that we think of as nouns or places as static in English are actually verbs. So like you don't say the lake, you say there, like there is a lake, or the lake is long, and it's one word and it's a verb. And so exploring my indigenous languages has really been one way that I've been like rethinking place in my writing.
Awesome, thank you. And also, I didn't say this before, but Kama, Cami, and Kofi, we have a lot of alliteration tonight. If anyone ever feels the urge to jump in and say something in response to someone else, you too, of course, Kai, please feel free to do so. I'm struck by what you're saying with all these references to language and water, which also, are relevant to all other three of our panelists. Kofi, I know you were talking about how much you've been thinking about water right now, and I saw you smiling. Is there something you can speak to there?
Oh God, I'm terrible at unmuting myself. Yeah, so something that I've been thinking about so often, and thinking about when reading your work, Kai, and your work also, Kama, is about, I was recently reading Kathy Clark Hong's Memoir, and she's a poet, so this is her first work of long nonfiction, Minor Feelings, an Asian American Reckoning. And there's this beautiful line where Hong talks about slitting open the belly of English and letting the dark, like, not, hold on, I want to read it because she's a poet, language is so important. And I also just emailed it to Cal, so I have it right here.
I have it here. Do you want me to read it, Kofi?
Oh no, I just found it. I'm sorry. Okay. Here we go. Slitting open the belly of English and seeing the bloody histories of imperialism fall out. Yes, I didn't want to misquote because I thought it was so brilliant. So I think about that very often, and also something that I was thinking about because I didn't grow up speaking either Haitian Creole or Tree, which is the indigenous language of Ghana that my dad speaks. But they're both languages that show up in my writing quite often because there are a lot of proverbs in Tree that I use very often. And I'm teaching myself both Tree and most recently Haitian Creole. And also there's kind of a trope, especially if you talk to Francophone people, that a lot of Creole languages, especially Haitian Creole, are like broken French. So when I think about using my languages, the languages of my people in my writing, I think about it with a lot of intention. And I think about breaking instead English or bending English as far as I can until it breaks, instead. And I think about, so I think about like what are the limitations, as colonized people of speaking and writing and thinking and performing in the language of, of my colonizers, either the English or the French, in my parents' case.
Sorry, muted. I wonder if, in relation to that, Kama, if you could speak to how you engage with those as a performer and a poet on the page now too with your book Zamfam, and speaking in, which also contains multiple different languages, like Kofi was saying, and connecting those to the land and to the water at the same time, which has such a strong presence in your book. Can you further that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. This is so rich. I have to say, I'm like mind blown already. What a privilege to share this space with all of you. Yeah, I mean, in many ways, like I do, as I said, I write from Mauritius. So I write very much from the island, but more so I write from the ocean. in terms of how this played out for me, like as a multidisciplinary artist, not so much even as a writer, like about a few years ago, like I kind of like developed an obsession with the ocean. And even materially, I started working with like a lot of salt and water in performances, installations, and and I had been exploring it for a while. And I think for me, there were two books that were actually very influential on my process. One of them being Naira Wahid's Salt, which when that book came out, I actually carried it in my bag for like, I think a year and a half. It was always, always, always with me. And once I went back home to Mauritius and actually sat down and read it by the ocean, which was like such an emotional, spiritual experience. And the other book that was very influential in thinking for this was Zong by Norbese Philip, a seminal Canadian literary work, but also like, African diasporic literary world. For those who don't know, basically the Zong was a slave ship that was leaving the west coast of Africa to come to the Americas. And long story short, they got lost along the way. They didn't have enough food, so they decided to throw away 150 slaves overboard so then they could claim them as insurance money because they were considered goods and not people, right? And basically what Norbese Philip does with this, all that survives of this case is just a legal document. And she takes that and unpacks that, right? And so she really thinks through, how do we use English as an imperial language, this legal document, and then how do we unpack it and then explode the language entirely to give voice to those people who were drowned. And I think that was very influential for me in terms of thinking, like in terms of that phase where, I'm still in that phase where I'm working so much with the figure of the ocean. And I think even as a performer, for me, there was something about going back to the ocean in terms of like reclaiming ancestry. For me, I haven't even known my own grandparents. And there's something about like the ancestors living in the ocean. And like, that's where I need to go to heal them, to find their voices. So which is one part that like speaks to me so very much. And in working on Zomfam, actually the poetry of Zomfam, one of the major questions for me that I had concerns was actually around the fact of using an imperial language, right? Like I'm using English. How do I claim or even try to articulate a decolonial poetics, a trans decolonial poetics that too, by using a colonial language? And I mean, the title of the book is Zomfam, which is Mauritian Creole, and that's absolutely intentional, in the sense of, because it was important for me to honor, like that local narrative that I was trying to build through this poetry. I would say I will add like just one more thing. Which was I think for me, interdisciplinarity and hybridity became a very rich space, like that's why, because this was actually, those pieces that became this book were initially spoken word pieces, and then the manuscript was developed for the stage, and then the stage manuscript was transformed into a book manuscript, right, where I really wanted the text of the poetry to perform on the page, just like the body was performing on the stage. And for bringing those different aspects where even the literary object became not just a literary object, but also a visual object, a performative object, was a way of actually playing within English and the authority of English. And I just want to add one last little thing, just as a response to Kofi, because for me, I spoke Mauritian Creole my entire life. It's my first language, and French too, and I'm a translator who translates work from English to French and into Creole as well. And I just wanted to share a tiny bit of that experience, because for me, working on this, given there are bits and pieces of Creole in this book, I spoke Creole my entire life, but Creole was only a spoken language. The first Creole dictionary was actually published about a decade ago. So in working on this, it's kind of fascinating because it's a language, it's my first tongue, but at the same time, I'm teaching myself now still how to write it, because I never learned it in school, or, unlike my cousins and my nephew and nieces who are learning it in school right now and know how to write it. And I don't know how to write the language. So that's also something that I'm working through.
Good. I'm glad you brought up Norbese Philip. We'll come back to her because you beat me there. But Kofi, you have something that you wanted to say.
Yeah, don't know how to lower my hand. That's okay. Yeah, I think this is a little bit of a two-parter. Thank you for sharing your experience. I feel like there were so many moments where I was just like, Yes, yes, yes. Oh my God, yes, the ocean. Oh my God. Because also in Haiti, Haitian Creole was not a spoken language either. I mean, was only a spoken language until I want to say 1992. Maybe a little bit earlier, maybe the mid 1900s, maybe the mid century. So even just having like I have like a textbook that's like maybe the size of LOL Beloved, right? That was published like 5 years ago, where I'm teaching it to myself. So that even just having that identification of, my mother was never taught Haitian Creole at school. She was only taught French. She's asking me questions like, why do you want to learn this language? I don't understand, like always taught to be ashamed of this language, and also just the phrasing you used, like our ancestors who were drowned, our ancestors who live in the water. There's just this there's this beautiful kind of there's this beautiful I don't even know how to describe it, but just kind of Haitian, just like general, like you just like, yeah, like, oh yeah, like the city of the ancestors is underwater. So like you just walk around and people are just like, yeah, like that's, yeah, exactly, right? Like that's how we talk about our ancestors in Haiti, and I write about that also, and I think about that quite often, or you talk about Guinea, which is another way of talking about the afterlife, the word Guinea, which could also be translated to a form of saying Africa, which is also underwater, which speaks very deeply to, the trend of slave trade, and also the idea of drowning, and the also idea of being on an island, so that spoke very deeply to me. And I love that you also brought up song, because it reminded me of Camellia, your piece, the idea of just working with found documents, and like how nonfiction can allow you to do that, and like the power of doing that, as marginalized folks, and of just and then like you said, so beautifully, of reinscribing, the narrative that has erased the voices of those people who are not considered people, those people are just like, yeah, no, we don't care. But no, Zong so beautifully uses this format to flip it on its head. Yeah,
Such a great response. I want to add one thread to that, and part of that, Kofi, is I want to read a brief bit from Cammie's book, Hall of Waters, because you're talking about, water as kind of the origin and a space where I think a lot of things spring forth. And so in this particular excerpt, Cammie writes, "There's no separating the clean living movement from the eugenics movement. They are springs that share the same aquifer, purity. All commercial waters in Excelsior Springs began to not only be categorized by mineral composition, but tested for mineral purity. How many milligrams of each mineral? How many ounces of the virginal spring? How many bottles to buy before you're clean? How much to drink to keep yourself white?" And Cammie, I want to be moving us from language into talking about form and genre soon, but I still want to give you a chance to talk to kind of the language you use here, and why did you go for springs and aquifer and using that language of water to talking about the associations between whiteness and purity in this particular space in your hometown, which you write about.
Yeah, well, essentially, this book, Hall of Waters, was an attempt for me to try to write something truthfully about this hometown, which, like most towns in the American Midwest, have this narrative about itself that elides a whole lot of anti-Blackness and elides a long history of settler colonialism. This town, Excelsior Springs, is named as such because there's a lot of mineral water springs, like a lot. There's 9 different mineral water compositions among the springs in the town's boundaries, and the City Hall building, which is this beautiful Art Deco building called the Hall of Waters, has the world's longest water bar. It's a very long bar with You can just drink some mineral water there. I think it's closed right now because there was some flooding. That's apropos. With the book, I was trying to do a number of things with language, actually, that, I mean, like the history of the water is there, and water is such a rich metaphor in a lot of ways. And this is fresh water and underground water, and the idea of things being kept under the surface. There's a lot of metaphor play here that just seemed right to go into. But there's also a lot of, in this book, where I'm playing around with the language of objectivity and legal documentation, because these are parts of ways that Midwestern settler history reinscribes itself, controlling the history, the documentation, stocking the libraries with these very skewed narratives of who the heroes of the town are, who discovered the town, because this town likes to pretend that no one was using these waters before some farmers and lawyers discovered things, which is ridiculous to me. And so I play around with a lot of lyric language, which wasn't something I did a lot of in my own writing. I work in the essay mode, in the essay tradition a lot, and most of my work was very long form before Hall of Waters, which is a book of largely one-page flash lyric memoir pieces. And I felt like that language of poetic subjectivity was necessary to disrupt all of the legal and history documentation that I was looking at, and that kids in this town grow up reading in schools, to try to counterbalance the narrative of what the town is on a language level. So that is sort of a fulcrum into a discussion of form, because there's parts of my book where I literally recreate Missouri State Department of Natural Resources documents about water-specific sites, and sort of recreate that form to play around with talking about places in town with a different kind of subjectivity. Yeah, I feel like the language play that I'm doing in this book was a mix of how can I subvert legalese and subvert the language of history textbook and the language of the self-mythologization of whiteness. And the answer for me anyway was let's lean into the lyric and try to put some feeling back into the records of a place that tried to cut away a lot of feeling to prove a mythical version of itself.
Awesome. Yeah, I think I do want to focus on form and how all of you are kind of fucking with form, which is something that Kofi, I think you said to me in an email. How are we all fucking with form, right? And I'm glad also that Norbese Phillip has stayed with us for a good chunk of this conversation, because her work was something I kept thinking about. And there's a particular essay that Evie Shockley writes about Phillip's work that's titled Going Overboard, African-American Poetic Innovation and the Middle Passage. But Shockley kind of zeroes in on Phillip talking about the fugue state as a dissociative order representing, quote, an escape from one mode of consciousness to another, and a literal escape from home to a new or unfamiliar place. And I wanted to present that kind of quote from Phillip and Shockley's quoting of her, because I think it speaks in interesting ways, Kai, to some of those lines that we pulled from your story earlier on about, does home mean the same thing? And also in thinking about form, how is, like, Zong is pulled from that one legal document, and so it's a fragment. It's not trying to be whole, right? It's trying to be something else. And so I wonder, Kai, if you have any thoughts about the form either of that story or forms that you're trying out now in different ways, and how they might help loosen the hold of some places that histories of place that they have on us.
Yeah. I feel like thinking about it, I write in very different forms depending on like the language I'm writing in and also the sort of genre. So that story in Love After the End is written, I think, in a way that's like uh, sort of kin to Cammie's book in some ways, because it's like it's written in very short chunks, numbered chunks that are like not necessarily long flowing passages, I guess. And um, I don't know. I think it gave me the opportunity to um, explore like different moments and different places without having to feel like rooted in one specific moment or place. But like there's also a weird dichotomy in my poetry, which is what I mostly am writing these days, where I sort of went through this phase where in English I just gave up on line breaks. Um, I just was like, I don't understand what the point of them are anymore. And like stream of consciousness like was just totally all that I was doing. Because I guess I think it helped me like try to like evokes the sort of essence of what I was trying to write about more clearly. But then when I write in Ojibwe, for example, I've been very much like sticking to like line break poetry as you would typically see it. But I don't know. I'm not sure how to connect that to place, but those are some of the things that I am thinking about with form lately. And like with the Ojibwe stuff too, it's like I think there's stuff that I'm drawing on where like there's a long history of like Ojibwe songs. And so trying to sort of invent a poetry tradition in a language that doesn't have a very long poetry tradition is like another thing that I'm dealing with creating like a new form out of old forms.
Heck yeah, new forms. I think it's great to acknowledge that also that like we sometimes don't know how to connect these things to place. Like we're trying to juggle so many different things here. And I just kind of see all five of us as like kind of, you know, rolling it forward a little bit more with each kind of contribution and thing that we're thinking about. So I appreciate that too, about like, you know, sometimes we don't know. And I wonder if it's that like, you know, then we move into like the physical and the embodiment, and like you just got to like step up and go outside and take a walk and like do some other kind of ritual to like ground yourself and bring it outside of your head, you know. I don't know if any of you want to speak to that, but we have about 10 more minutes where we can keep talking, and then I want to leave a couple minutes for questions toward the end. Let's see. Okay, I can ask another question.
Can I quickly maybe respond to that then, if that's okay? Because yeah, I think there's a lot that actually really speaks to me in terms of the ways in which I've been going, right? As I said, with this body of work, like a lot of even thinking, because it was spoken word first, right? Like before it landed on the page, like there was something for me about the voice and the voice of the ocean, right? Like in terms of how it was written orally and how it was supposed to be delivered orally. Like there was something very intentional about the rhythm of the ocean and the movement of the ocean. And there's something for me about this as a hybrid space. I go back to the hybrid space because I think a lot of like place in terms like, you know, of gender crossings, what I call gender travels, right? Like the call to travel across gender, and then how does that relate to the traveling across space? But then what if you're always in movement, right? Like what if you're always that wave of the ocean and that non-place, you know, and then if we're talking about the ancestors and the voices of the ghosts, right, like that are trapped in the ocean, like they are neither dead nor living because they are ghosts, right? Like, and again, for me, I'm like, it's the middle space, it's that hybrid space, that's how, you know, like there's something about that. And then increasingly so my work like has been grounded more and more like in terms of like new work that I've been developing over the past year or so. Like I think that return to ritual actually has been like a new way of I wouldn't say new, but like a rediscovered language as a way of being, as a way of doing, but that's actually connected to the intuition, which is not always fixed, which is in movement, so that I can then create space, within my own body or my own spirit to hear the voices. So I relate a lot to that notion of ritualized non-place.
That's wonderful.
And
Kofi,
like Kai was saying earlier, about place as verb, I'm thinking, based on what you're just saying, Kama, this idea of like not locating the work in a place, but the place is part of the voice of the work, and it's a collaboration. Like your name or my name on the cover of a book is not the fullest extent of what the authorship of the project is in that sense, which is very fascinating to me, the relational quality between individual writer voice and the voice of place that we're in conversation with.
I like that, the voice of place. That's a fun phrase I haven't really heard before. And Kofi, I was gonna ask you, because I think about your essay Holding Pattern, in which you're writing about a lot of things about mental health and lineage, and also your grandmother who dies on an airplane. So in between places, right? And this is something that is extremely, fraught throughout that essay, and you're doing so much with form there, and genre and nonfiction as well, because you're alternating between speakers. And so I wonder, either in writing that essay or in more of your work, how was, or what are you trying, the circling of the airplane in the air with your grandmother on it is kind of something that holds so much tension for me, because it is in between place. And I just wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
I absolutely can, yeah. So when I was writing that piece, I actually wrote most of that piece during, is this true? Am I about to lie? Nah, probably not. Probably, yeah. Is it a lie? No. Yeah, yes or no. I wrote most of this piece during, from the beginning of the pandemic to around the height of the pandemic in New York, which is to say that, and for some context, most of my family, and I'm from New York, and most of my family work in the medical field, and death was on my mind day in and day out. And I was also reading Toni Morrison's Beloved every day. Like I would read it, and then I would finish it, and then I would read it again. Or I'd be listening to it on audiobook, and then I would finish it, and I would listen to it again. And I would be doing that constantly. And I was also in grad school at the time, doing stuff probably, but I don't remember doing anything else. Which is to say that I kind of associated, which is to say that kind of like how, you had salt, when you were talking about how you had salt in your bag and you had zong in your bag for like a year, and you were thinking about the ocean, you're thinking about the waves and rhythm, and you're thinking about form. I was thinking about 124, I was thinking about the house, I was thinking about haunting, I was thinking about the plane, I was thinking about, it was almost as if, and I had read Beloved before, but it was almost as if within the context of a year ago, after the experiences that I had had that take place in that essay, I was reading Beloved, and I had felt Toni Morrison giving me the permission to really fuck shit up, essentially. Because there's moments in that book where you're in a sentence and you literally halfway through the sentence change point of view, and you don't realize that until halfway down the page. And I was like, oh, that's cool. I'll do that. Let me try that shit. And none of it is for no reason, all of it is in the service. I mean, for me, when I'm fucking shit up, it's usually in the service of putting my readers in a headspace that I have been in or that I'm in right now, right? So it's almost just carrying Beloved with me through writing the essay or through writing different projects gave me the permission to scare people. It's almost as if like when you asked me about genre, I was like, oh yeah, I have been kind of a spooky person my whole life, but it's like I didn't realize that like nonfiction could be so spooky, because yes, Beloved is it's so much as if because Beloved is so beloved, right? Oh my God, this like high literary piece of art. People forget that it is a horror story. It's about a haunted house at its core. It is about ghosts. It's about people being haunted. So I think about it, and I think about, oh, I can do that. I can create work that, for lack of a better word, I just watched a Jordan Peele interview. Like, I can create work that wields fear. I can create work that makes that also creates like that kind of like that like either that like feeling of like that bridge that Beloved is standing on, or that we are always crouching. We have always been crouching. Series of paragraphs in Beloved. That kind of affect that I think about very often. Yeah. So absolutely, yeah. I think that when I think about that experience, I think about how much it affected like how I could. And it's also related to language as well. I mean, it's like form of language. It's like how much can I break the English language that is like broken, literally. I mean, in nonfiction, like broken, like the Black people that I love and know in my life.
Yeah, and also I'm struck too when you're talking, Kofi, about how much haunting is tied to place sometimes too, right? We often think of like, sure, haunted house is the most obvious one, and it's in there, but it's so tied to place, right? And I never quite thought about it that way until you said that. And I wonder, well, before I kind of vocalize another question, let me just say, invite people in the chat. Please feel free to drop any questions if you have them. We're coming up on 5:30, and I want to, we can keep going, of course. As you can see, we can keep going. I could probably spend an hour with each person individually here talking about these things. So it's always hard to think about that. But if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. I saw one question from my dad up there asking me a question, and I don't know if we'll get to that, but because I want to keep the spotlight on all of you. But it's a good question about water and place, and certain themes of climate change as well that we're facing right now. And I wonder, I had a question that I did want to ask about climate grief, which is something that we're hearing talked about more and more. There's a wonderful essay, I'll look up the link and drop it in the chat in a moment, by Nar Gavin, that is about the limitations of climate grief and how it can, exhaust and prevent people from doing things and taking part in things, as in like the loss of these environments due to climate change. And it's very trendy in novels right now, and how it can kind of, prevent people from taking part in things that might eventually help alleviate suffering in the future. And I wanted to ask any of you how you write through grief, how you're haunted by grief or by this specter of like climate change and change to environments, and maybe how you're thinking about that in future work. If anyone has something they would like to say about that.
I do,
Who's
but
got-
I do, but I just spoke. It's okay if anyone else has something to say.
Anyone taking Kofi up on their invitation?
Well, I wanted to check with Camellia and Kai actually, because I feel like I've also spoken quite a bit. So if either of the two of you wants to go first, please do.
Oh, well, I'll just say that what I've been writing lately has been it has been about grief, but it's on the personal side, about my mother who passed away in 2016. But that isn't to say that a whole lot of my mental headspace isn't occupied with anxiety over climate, because it is. And I think that what's actually good for my writing is that I'm not like writing about it. I'm channeling all that. And I could go on a long anarchist spiel here, but I won't. And we'll just say that there's plenty of direct action that we can take. And sort of climate doomerism is not the way forward. And I find that channeling those anxieties for me into, whether you want to call it activist work or call it actions, political action, makes me feel a lot more hopeful about things, because there's a lot that we can do here and a lot that we should do, and in terms of working collectively. And so being mindful of that and putting my energy and my body into political work as an anarchist helps me with writing all the mom shit that I'm writing about, helps free up the creative space to not be all doom and gloom. I think that's a part of my writing practice that doesn't show up on the page, but is instrumental. That's all I wanted to say about that.
Kama or Kai.
Yeah, I have a thought if we have time. So I was actually just having some conversations with folks, some other Indigenous people from my community about sort of the feelings of hopelessness that a lot of people have. And I think that, so I write a lot of, most of my fiction is like speculative fiction. It's like either alternate histories or it's like near future Indigenous futurisms. And so like with a story like How to Survive the Apocalypse for Native Girls, I don't really spend a lot of time talking about like what actually happened in the apocalypse. It's kind of like left for people to imagine, but I almost feel like I don't have the luxury to imagine the end of the world, or I don't have the imagination to imagine the end of the world, because it's just too hard for me to look at everything that my ancestors have been through, that my people are going through today, and to like imagine that we won't somehow get through this too. And so when I'm writing, like a lot of that is, my fiction in particular is about like imagining the world on the other side of this. And because I'm also a historian, I really like to think about like, how will the future historians write about what we're going through right now? So those are some of the like, and then of course, you know, it is hard because my community has been dealing with like, you know, trying to shut down Line 5 in the Straits of Mackinac. And where I've been living in Minnesota has all the stuff going on right now with Line 3. I was talking to you on Twitter, Cal, about like the experience of sugar bush season changing. So it is like really real, but I also there's like a part of me that can't give up on this level of hope of like, we'll get through it somehow, and maybe things will be really, really different on the other side. But I like to imagine what that other world will look like.
That's beautiful. Do we have, I know we're at 5:30. Do we have another minute or two to go over? Is that okay, Emily? You can either nod or not.
Yeah, I think so. If people have to go, they can go, but they'll be missing
Okay. We won't go too much longer, but I do want to give Kama and Kofi a chance. I know you both had something on your minds. Maybe it's changed some now that you've heard from Kaya and Cami as well.
Well, I'm going to try to make this quick and succinct then. Just in terms of like, you know, I think for me, the short answer is that like the sense of urgency has changed, and what even my work is about has changed. And that came about exactly a year ago now that I realized we're in July. Basically, you know, I fundamentally believe that you know, like I didn't say that when I was younger, but now with time, that's how I frame it. My narrative of it is that I got a calling to travel across genders, just like I got a calling to travel across lands and waters, which, you know, in my as an immigrant. And I think I got the calling. I think for me, at least, I got the calling to be an artist. I see those really in a very spiritual ways now. And a year ago, basically, the MV Wakasho, which was a Japanese vessel that was actually sailing to Brazil under a Panamanian flag. It was all very confusing because there was no international accountability around it. But long story short, that vessel hit the coral reefs of Mauritius, and more than 1,000 tons of crude oil was spilled into the lagoons, which historically speaking is the biggest ecological disaster that has ever happened to Mauritius. And that was in July of 2020. And in July of 2020 was the same time my book came out in September of 2020. And in July, we started gearing up, right? Like that's when I started doing events in, you know, like to talk about this book. And there's, you know, there's one of the pieces in the book called Your Body is the Ocean, and the your refers to the child. It's like the adult speaking back to the child saying, your body is home, your body is an island, your body is home, your body is the ocean. And here I am, you know, about to put this work into the world just at the same time that that this ecological disaster happens. And you know, and there was just something about the grief, because I had worked a lot on the notions of grief for years before that, also interested in my personal life. And I felt, and suddenly there was a totally new kind of grief that I had never experienced, right? Like we're in the middle of a global lockdown, you're just like watching images of crude oil being spilled into the lagoons. You can't even do anything, you can't even fly there, right? Like there's nothing you can do, and you have to watch it from that distance. And I think for me, there was something in that moment where I really had to interrogate myself around, what is my job? What is my role as an artist, right? If I got the calling to write stories and make art and put stories out into the world, why did I get that calling? And what is the story then that I put into the world? And I think for me, in terms of that ecological crisis, it totally just shifted my sense of urgency in terms of, how I want to be making work, but also the kind of work that I want to be making. And which is why now I'm talking more about like moving in towards like an ecological / spiritual space in terms of my art making. Really, that's what all my upcoming projects are really all about. Because I think, I've really been thinking about what that calling, what is the work that I'm meant to be creating in this moment.
Beautiful. I love it. Kofi, do you want to respond to that or speak your...
Sorry, I was just saying. Can you repeat the question?
Oh, I was just wondering if you had any additional thoughts to close us out about grief and how you work through it in your work, whether related to place or not.
I had a very specific response to the way that you framed the climate grief.
Oh, and how climate grief makes us feel hopeless and not able to take action, I suppose.
Yes. Okay. So I did have a feeling about that. So, you should take this with a grain of salt, because I currently have just so much grief in my body that I just have been unable to process for a bunch of reasons. So just keep that in mind while I respond to this. But also I think that I think that in a lot of ways, whiteness and global white supremacy is fueling that response, like fueling like that kind of like hopelessness and that like climate grief and that whole thing. I was like, and by that I mean, in this country, we're not given the tools to grieve, actually. And I'll just speak for myself in this case. After losing a bunch of people in like a really short period of time, including my grandmother, who I spoke about, nobody wants to hear about anything about grief. People are like, my God, what's going on with that? And that's like vastly contrasted with the kind of just like both cultures that my parents come from, you know, where death is not, where just, you know, death and the dead are not so far from the living, you know. And I actually think that that's kind of related to part of what you were talking about, Kamala. You know, just like, you know, both the ecological and the spiritual are also related to, you know, the way that we think of and conceive of, you know, grief, right? And the further they get from each other, the more hopeless we get. And that's very related to, you know, this like white American culture in general, you know, like the cemetery is over there and it's really theoretical. And what's a dead person? I want to be young forever. The elderly, just call me grandma killer. I don't care. Like, what? What did you just say? You know? Yeah, that's all I got.
That's great. All four of you, those answers were wonderful to that last question. I couldn't really have asked for a better kind of summation of what we've been talking about to end on. I haven't seen additional questions in the chat. I hope that means that everyone here has been just totally held wrapped and enjoying what Kama, Kofi, Kai, and Cami were speaking about. I certainly did, and I'm really grateful to all four of you for coming and being a part of this. Thank you so much. And thank you to Emily and Charlie, The Common and Foglifter for co-sponsoring this. Thank you to Metonymy Press, who also generously supported this event and published Kama's book and my own. But I've been dreaming of an event like this for a long time. So I'm really happy it came together, and thank you everyone who came here. And yeah, check out some of those resources that we dropped in the chat. Thanks everybody. Have a good night.